The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it assaults you. Standing outside the iron gate, shivering in a thin hoodie, I knew my life had changed forever. It sounds dramatic, but it's true. At 16, I was thrown out in the rain because of a story my sister made up. Mom screamed, "Pack your things and go." I didn't argue. I just left. 10 minutes later, she texted her friends joking about it. Not knowing Dad had cast the message onto the living room television. That text was the end of everything she knew. 20 minutes earlier, the house had smelled of roasted garlic. I was setting the table when the scream tore through the ceiling. Tiffany sprinted down the stairs, clutching her phone like a weapon. Her face was a perfect mask of devastated innocence. She sobbed that $12,000 was gone from her inheritance fund, transferred out while she napped. She pointed a manicured finger at me and claimed I used her Face ID. I didn't even get a chance to deny it before the chaos started. My mother didn't check the bank app. She didn't ask for proof. She just looked at me with that familiar, absolute disgust. Patricia crossed the room in 2 strides, and the slap echoed louder than the thunder. It wasn't discipline, it was pure hatred. She grabbed my arm, nails digging into my skin, and dragged me toward the heavy oak door. She threw me out like garbage, screaming that thieves didn't deserve shelter in her home. She didn't even let me grab my shoes. I stumbled onto the wet porch concrete, the cold wind hitting me instantly. I turned back, breathless, intending to ask her to at least let me grab a coat. I needed to explain that I was at swim practice during the transfer. But Patricia didn't wait for explanations. She stared at me through the crack in the door, her eyes devoid of warmth. "Don't come back until you learn to stop lying," she hissed. Then she slammed the heavy wood in my face. The rain wasn't falling down. It was coming sideways. They call it an atmospheric river here in Seattle. But that night, it felt like an ocean trying to drown me. I stood there, shivering in a T-shirt and jeans. My jaw shook so violently that my teeth clicked together like dice in a cup. I tried to tuck my hands into my pockets, but the denim was already soaked through, heavy and useless. My fingers felt like foreign objects, numb and clumsy against my legs. Any normal teenager locked out in a storm would be screaming. They would be pressing the intercom, begging their mother for mercy, just to get back into the warmth. But I stayed silent. I realized something in that freezing darkness. My mother wasn't trying to teach me a lesson. She was enjoying this. She wanted me to break. If I begged, I was validating her world. The realization killed the fear instantly. The lock clicked shut, a sound of finality echoing louder than the thunder. The cold wasn't just on my skin anymore. It had burrowed deep inside my bones. My whole body seized up, shaking so hard that my vision blurred at the edges. I tried to rub my arms for friction, but my hands were clumsy blocks of ice. The wind coming off the Puget Sound felt like wet sandpaper against my exposed face. Standing there, I realized 15 minutes had passed since the door slammed. It felt like 10 hours. Through the glowing bay window, I saw them clearly. My mother was pouring tea from her favorite floral porcelain pot. Steam rose from the cups, looking impossibly warm and inviting. Tiffany sat opposite her, wrapped in a thick cashmere throw, looking fragile and comforted. She wiped a fake tear from her cheek, and Mom leaned in to touch her hand. They looked like a scene from a holiday card. I was the ghost haunting their perfect little life. Tiffany had been perfecting that wounded look since we were toddlers. She knew exactly how to tremble her lip, to bypass logic, and trigger Mom's protective instincts. Seeing her cozy and safe, while I froze solidified the truth I had been avoiding. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was a calculated eviction. She didn't just want the money, she wanted to see me destroyed. She was smiling behind her teacup, savoring the victory of my absolute absence. My mother needed a villain, just as much as Tiffany needed to be the victim. Without a bad seed to discipline, Patricia would have to examine her own miserable marriage or her shallow parenting. I was the convenient container for all her frustration. If I banged on the window now, I would just be proving I was the unruly animal she claimed I was. So I stayed still. I let the rain soak me until I stopped feeling the cold. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers slipping on the wet screen. The battery icon was a thin, red sliver, mocking me at 2%. I tried to open the dialer, but the screen didn't register my numb touch. I wiped it on my shirt, but everything was saturated. Then, the screen flickered once and went black. My lifeline was dead. I was truly alone in the dark, trapped between the locked gate and the storm. My legs started to give out. The shivering had turned into a violent, uncontrollable rattling that made my chest ache. I leaned against the rough brick of the gate pillar, sliding down until I was crouching in the mud. The security lights flickered above me, casting long, distorted shadows across the driveway. I wondered if they would find me here in the morning, a frozen statue of their neglect. The thought didn't scare me, it felt strangely peaceful. I closed my eyes, ready to let the darkness take over. Then, a sound cut through the relentless drumming of the rain. It was the deep, mechanical growl of a heavy engine turning onto our street. I forced my heavy eyelids open. Twin beams of white light sliced through the downpour like lasers, blinding and brilliant. I wasn't waiting for a savior, but as the massive black SUV roared toward the gate without slowing down, I knew he was here. My father's SUV didn't slow down as it approached the estate entrance. He knew the gate code and the remote frequency. But he didn't use either of them. He saw his teenage daughter standing in the freezing rain, and he saw the iron bars locking her out. He made a choice that told me everything I needed to know about whose side he was on. He swerved hard to the right, the engine roaring a deep, mechanical growl. The vehicle jumped the curb, tires tearing through the pristine sod my mother spent thousands maintaining. There was a sickening, satisfying crunch as the heavy grille plowed straight through Patricia's prize, winning hydrangea bushes, flattening the landscaping, and bypassing the locked gate entirely. He didn't stop until his bumper was inches from the front porch steps. The engine died, but the silence that followed was heavier than the storm. He opened his door, stepping into the mud without hesitation. He didn't run to me, he stalked. He pulled off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around me in one fluid motion. The warmth was shocking, instantly painful against my numb skin, but the look on his face was colder than the ice storm. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask for my side of the story. He looked at the locked front door, then at me, and his eyes went completely dark. "Stay behind me," he said. His voice was low and terrifyingly calm. He walked up the wet steps and didn't bother reaching for his key ring. He kicked the front door, right below the deadbolt. It was solid mahogany, built to withstand intruders and storms. But it wasn't built to withstand a father who had just seen his child treated like a stray animal. He drew his leg back and struck it again, harder this time. The wood splintered with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot. The heavy door swung inward, bouncing violently off the interior wall. The transition was instant and jarring. 1 second, I was in a chaotic, freezing hurricane. The next, I was standing in a silent, golden, lit foyer that smelled of lavender and expensive tea. The sudden lack of wind made me dizzy. I gripped the back of his wet shirt, afraid I might fall over. Patricia was standing in the middle of the living room, a porcelain teacup frozen halfway to her mouth. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look horrified that her husband had just driven across the lawn and kicked in the door. She looked annoyed. She looked like a hostess whose dinner party had been interrupted by a rude guest. "Have you lost your mind, Robert?" she snapped, setting the cup down with a sharp, irritated clink. "You ruined the flower beds," she continued, her voice rising. "I told you I was handling her discipline. She needs to learn that actions have consequences." My father didn't even look at her. He didn't validate her with an argument. He didn't scream about the cold or the cruelty. He walked right past her, his wet boots leaving dark, muddy streaks on the cream-colored Persian rug. The door swung shut behind us, trapping the scent of deceit inside. Robert didn't even slow down to acknowledge Patricia's screaming. He walked straight to the beige linen sofa, where Tiffany was curled up under a cashmere blanket. She looked wide-eyed and fragile, clutching her iPad to her chest like a shield. "Robert, don't you dare ignore me!" my mother yelled, her voice rising an octave. "Your daughter is a thief. She stole $12,000. My father stopped in front of Tiffany, towering over her, dripping rainwater onto the expensive upholstery. Tiffany tried to shrink back into the cushions, summoning those crocodile tears that had worked on everyone else for 17 years. She opened her mouth to whimper, to play the victim for the audience of one, but my father held out his broad hand. "Give it to me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a judge delivering a verdict. "It's private," Tiffany squeaked, glancing nervously at Mom for backup. I said, "Give it to me." He didn't wait for her permission. He reached down and ripped the iPad out of her hands with a single, decisive motion. "That's my property!" Tiffany shrieked. It wasn't a scared sound anymore. It was the entitled screech of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. She lunged for the device. Her nails clawing at Dad's wet coat, but he held it high out of her reach, like he was keeping a dangerous toy away from a toddler. "Give it back to her, Robert!" Mom shouted, stepping between them to physically block him. "You are violating her privacy. You have no right to treat your daughter like a criminal in her own home." My father looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I pay the bill," he said, his voice cutting through their noise like a blade. "I own the account. I have every right." The silence that followed was suffocating. Patricia blinked, her mouth opening and closing uselessly. He didn't waste time guessing her passcode or arguing about ethics. He turned his back on them and walked over to the 80-inch OLED screen mounted above the fireplace. Mom usually kept it on a loop of serene landscape paintings to impress guests. But tonight it was going to serve a different purpose. He tapped the screen of the iPad. He didn't need a code. He had set up the family sharing plan himself. He knew every back door into this device. Tiffany scrambled off the couch, her blanket falling to the floor. "Dad, stop! You can't just look through my stuff!" For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. It wasn't fear of his anger, it was the terrified realization that her curated narrative was about to collapse. She rushed toward him, but he simply held up a hand to stop her. He swiped down on the control center and hit the screen mirroring icon. The television flickered. The peaceful mountain meadow on the television vanished in a burst of static. In its place, Tiffany's home screen appeared, magnified to a terrifying 4 feet wide. Every app, every notification, and every lie was now broadcast in high definition. The room went deadly quiet. The only sound was the rain hammering against the broken door. My father didn't look at the screen himself. He looked at Patricia. "You wanted to talk about consequences," he said. "Let's look at the evidence." Robert didn't hesitate to use his authority. "Move," he said to Patricia, who was frantically trying to block the view of the television. He tapped the blue Venmo icon on the giant screen. There was no hacking involved. No complex technical wizardry needed to uncover the truth. It was just there, right at the top of the transaction history, glaring in bright green text. Sent to Lux Life, resale $12,500. The memo line read simply, "Investment piece." Patricia stared at the number on the giant screen, blinking rapidly. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land, struggling for oxygen in the sudden vacuum of truth. "That proves nothing," she stammered, desperate to keep her worldview from collapsing. "Sienna could have done that. She knows the passcode. She could have stolen the iPad while Tiffany was sleeping and made the transfer to frame her." She pointed a shaking finger at me, her eyes filled with manic accusation. "Is that right?" Dad asked, his voice deceptively mild. He didn't look at me for confirmation. He swiped up on the screen. He opened the mail app next. The latest email was timestamped just 3 hours ago. "Subject: your order has shipped. Sender: channel official." The tracking number was live and blue. He tapped it, and the map zoomed in on the giant display. The delivery address wasn't my room, and it wasn't a locker. It was addressed to Tiffany St. James. The address was listed as care of Sienna Miller, 2 streets over. "Did Sienna order a $5,000 handbag to your best friend's house, Tiffany?" Dad asked, finally turning to look at the girl on the couch. "Did she forge the confirmation email, too?" Tiffany was shaking her head violently, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't the cute, sympathetic tears she used on Mom. These were the ugly, splotchy tears of a cornered animal caught in a trap of its own making. "I needed it," she sobbed, abandoning the denial for justification. "Everyone has one. You don't understand the pressure at school." Her voice cracked, shrill and piercing. "But that's not the worst part," Dad said, cutting her off. He wasn't done digging. He swiped again, bringing up the transaction time details. "Look at the timestamp, Patricia. 4:15 p.m. He pointed to the clock on the mantel. Where was Sienna at 4:15 p.m. today? Do you even know where your daughter was? Patricia looked blank. She had no idea where I was because she never tracked my schedule. She was at swim practice. Dad answered for her. I know because I pay the coach. I have the attendance log right here on my phone. He pulled out his own device. But he didn't need to show it. The truth was already evident in Patricia's shrinking posture. The timeline was physically impossible. I couldn't be in the pool and hacking an iPad simultaneously. It's just money. Patricia shouted, trying to regain ground. We can return the bag. We can get the money back. It's just a mistake. Dad looked at the iPad in his hand, his expression hardening into granite. He wasn't looking at the bank app anymore. He had seen a notification banner drop down while we were arguing. He tapped it. It's not just money, he whispered. It's malice. He opened the messaging app, and the screen shifted again. Dad didn't scroll randomly. He went straight to the pinned group chat at the top of the list. The chat was named Queens of the Hill and had an emoji of a crown next to it. The silence in the room stretched thin, vibrating with the tension of an impending explosion. Patricia tried to grab his arm, her nails digging into his wet coat, but he shook her off without looking. He tapped the thread. The entire conversation history populated the massive screen, blowing up teenage gossip into billboard-sized indictments. The latest message was time, stamped just 20 minutes ago. Everyone in the room read the words at the exact same time. It wasn't a vague comment or a complaint. It was a confession. OMG, you guys, it actually worked. The loser is literally freezing outside the gate right now. Mom is totally buying it. She's pouring me tea. I am a genius. Bye, Sienna. The words hung there, sharp and undeniable against the white background. Tiffany didn't just lie to save herself, she lied to hurt me. She had orchestrated my suffering as entertainment for her friends. The cruelty was the point. But the text wasn't the worst part. Below the bubble was an image attachment. Dad tapped it, expanding the thumbnail to fill the entire 80-inch display. It was a blurry, zoomed-in photo taken from this very living room window. In the center of the frame, a figure stood huddled against the iron gate, shoulders hunched against the driving rain. It was me. She had watched me shaking in the cold, snapped a picture, and sent it to her friends for laughs. The golden chilled narrative didn't just crack, it shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Dad stared at the message, reading it once, twice, 3 times. The anger that had propelled him through the front door seemed to drain away, replaced by something far more terrifying: heartbreak. He slowly turned to look at Mom, his face pale under the harsh foyer lights. You said you were protecting the family, he whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. Look at that screen, Patricia. Look at what you were actually protecting. He wasn't yelling anymore. He sounded like a man waking up in a burning house, realizing the fire started years ago. She's 16, Robert. Mom's voice was shrill, bordering on hysterical. She stepped in front of the television, trying to block the damning image of the group chat with her own body. It's just a mistake. She was acting out. Girls her age do stupid things when they feel threatened. She was desperate to normalize the sadism, to paint it as typical sibling rivalry. We can fix this. We can delete the thread. Don't make this a federal case. She was still managing the PR, ignoring the rot. She refused to see the monster she created. Tiffany was sobbing into her hands now, making wet, gasping sounds that might have been apologies if anyone was listening. But she wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at Dad. She was peeking through her fingers at the television, terrified that her friends might reply and expose her further. She didn't care about the morality, she cared about the exposure. I realized then that she didn't possess the capacity for guilt. She only felt shame when she was caught. The realization made me feel colder than the storm outside ever had. "It is not just a mistake," Dad said, his voice regaining its steel. "It is a campaign." He stepped around Patricia, ignoring her physical blockade. He swiped up on the screen, closing the messages and opening the Photos app. "You want to talk about acting out? Let's see the deleted folder." Patricia froze. "Robert, stop this immediately. You've humiliated her enough." But he didn't stop. He tapped the trash can icon. There were dozens of screenshots. My diary pages. My swimsuit photos. All saved, annotated, and ready to be weaponized. I stepped closer to the screen, mesmerized by the archive of hatred. There were dates going back months. Plans to sabotage my alarm clock before meets. Drafts of rumors to start about me at school. This wasn't impulsive. This was a hobby. "She didn't just make up a story today," I said, my voice sounding strange in the quiet room. "She's been writing this story for years." Dad looked at me, and for the first time, I saw him acknowledge the years of blindness he was guilty of. We were seeing the same ghost. Dad turned back to Tiffany, who had gone silent. Realizing her digital footprint was a confession she couldn't cry her way out of. "You didn't just want the money," Dad said, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. "You wanted to erase your sister." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. But this time he wasn't checking a bank app. He was dialing a number. He looked at Mom, his eyes dead. "You said I had no right to discipline her. You were wrong." He pressed call. "Who are you calling?" Mom demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and uncertainty. She assumed he was calling a divorce attorney, ready for a long, expensive battle she thought she could win. "Sheriff Miller," Dad said into the receiver, his eyes never leaving hers. "I need an officer at the St. James estate immediately. We have a domestic disturbance and a violation of a restraining order." He hung up before she could interrupt. Patricia laughed, a brittle, incredulous sound. "A restraining order? You can't be serious. This is my house, Robert." Dad reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. It wasn't paper. It was a laminated copy of the deed trust. "Actually, it's not," he said, unfolding it with deliberate slowness. "You live here as a trustee, Patricia. The house is held in a generation, skipping trust for the children." He placed the document on the coffee table, smoothing it flat. "You know the terms. You signed them. Your residency is conditional on the primary requirement, providing a safe, stable environment for the beneficiaries." His finger tapped the bold text. Patricia stared at the legal language, her face draining of color. She knew exactly what the clause said, but she never thought he would weaponize it. Clause 4, Section B. Dad recited from memory, his voice devoid of mercy. "Any action that endangers the physical health or safety of a beneficiary, immediately voids the trustee's right to occupancy. He gestured to me, shivering in his oversized coat. Locking a minor out in an atmospheric river without a coat constitutes immediate physical endangerment. You didn't just punish her, you evicted yourself. It was 20 minutes. Mom shrieked, looking for an exit that didn't exist. She wasn't going to die. You are being dramatic. Dad didn't blink. It is 34 degrees outside. Wet clothes in wind chill accelerates hypothermia in under 15 minutes. Her teeth were chattering when I found her. Her hands were numb. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space for the first time in years. If I had arrived 10 minutes later, we would be at the hospital. You gambled with her life to prove a point. Blue and red lights flashed against the rain, streaked window, painting the living room in a chaotic strobe. The sheriff had been patrolling nearby. The response was terrifyingly fast. Patricia rushed to the window, watching the patrol car crunch over the ruined hydrangeas. "You can't do this," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Robert, please. Where will we go?" It was the first time I had ever heard her beg. She wasn't begging for forgiveness, though. She was begging for the status she was about to lose. Sheriff Miller knocked on the door frame. The door itself was hanging off its hinges, useless. He stepped inside, water dripping from his brim, looking from the shattered wood to the sobbing girl on the couch. "Robert." He nodded, his hand resting near his belt. "I got the call about a hostile occupant." Dad pointed at Patricia. "She has violated the terms of the trust deed. She is trespassing as of 10 minutes ago." He handed the sheriff the laminated document. Miller scanned it, his eyebrows raising slightly. Miller turned to Patricia. He didn't look sympathetic. He looked tired of cleaning up rich people's messes. "Mrs. St. James, the document is clear. If Mr. St. James is invoking the safety clause, I have to ask you to vacate the premises until a court says otherwise." Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls like a cliché. "Tonight." "But it's storming." Miller gestured to the open door. "You put your daughter out in it. I suggest you grab a coat. You have 10 minutes to collect essential items only." Tiffany finally processed the reality of the situation. Her sobbing stopped abruptly. "Wait, what about me?" she asked, her voice small. "I didn't sign anything. I can stay, right, Dad?" She looked at him with wide, hopeful eyes, trying to leverage the biological connection she had just mocked in the group chat. Dad shook his head, a look of profound pity crossing his face. "You are a minor, Tiffany. You go where your mother goes. Maybe she can teach you how to survive in the real world." The next 10 minutes were a blur of frantic motion. Sheriff Miller stood by the stairs, watching as they ran up to their rooms. They didn't pack clothes. They grabbed jewelry boxes, chargers, and Tiffany's precious designer bags. It was a grotesque display of priorities. I stood by the fireplace, the warmth finally returning to my fingers, watching the people who had tormented me for years scramble like rats on a sinking ship. They were stripping the rooms, trying to hoard value, still failing to understand what matters. They came down the stairs dragging 2 suitcases each, looking ridiculous in their fur-lined coats. Patricia refused to look at me. Tiffany glared, her face blotchy and ruined, muttering something about how I would pay for this. Dad didn't respond. He just pointed to the door. They stepped out onto the porch, and the wind immediately caught Patricia's hair, whipping it across her face. The sheriff followed them out. Dad walked to the door, grabbed the handle, and shoved the broken wood into the frame, sealing out the cold. The heavy front door was splintered, but Dad shoved a sturdy dining chair under the handle to keep it shut against the wind. The silence that filled the house wasn't empty. It was heavy with relief. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to listen for footsteps. I didn't have to gauge the mood of the room by the clinking of teacups. The toxicity had been dragged out into the rain. I slumped against the wall, my legs finally giving out, sliding down until I hit the floor. Dad didn't try to hug me immediately. Knowing I was probably too brittle to be touched, he just knelt down and checked my hands, chafing them gently to bring the blood back. "Go sit by the fire," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I'll make the cocoa." It was a small thing. A callback to when I was 5, before Tiffany turned the house into a war zone. I nodded, walking on unsteady legs toward the hearth. The fire was still burning, indifferent to the drama. I heard the familiar sounds of the kitchen. The whisk against the copper pot, the gas burner clicking on. It sounded like a home instead of a stage set. A few minutes later, he returned with 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to me, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "I should have looked sooner," he said, staring into the flames. "I thought I was keeping the peace. I didn't realize I was funding a war against my own daughter." He didn't ask for forgiveness, knowing he hadn't earned it yet. I looked at the dark liquid in the mug. For years, I told myself that if I just stayed quiet, if I just took the hits, they would eventually get tired. I believed that endurance was a virtue. I was wrong. Endurance just gave them permission to hit harder. Dad sat on the coffee table facing me, effectively blocking the view of the broken door. He wasn't the distant Czech writer anymore. He was the wall between me and the world. The sudden shift in gravity made me dizzy. "Go rest," he said gently. "I'll call the contractor in the morning." I walked up the stairs, passing Tiffany's open door. Her room looked like a looted palace, drawers flung open and hangers bare. It didn't look scary anymore, it just looked pathetic. I entered my own room and closed the door. Usually, I wedged a rubber stop under it to delay intruders, but tonight I didn't reach for it. The lock on the front door was broken, but for the first time, the house was actually secure. I sat on my bed, wrapping the duvet around my shoulders. The rain lashed against the window, but it couldn't touch me. The atmospheric river was just weather now, not a weapon. I looked at the empty space where my anxiety used to live. It was gone, evicted along with the people who planted it. I lifted the mug to my lips, letting the steam warm my face. I took a sip of the cocoa, and for the first time in 16 years, I didn't taste fear.